The Devil's Iron. The desert night was alive with whispers. Not the kind carried by the wind, but something deeper. Something that slithered through the cracks of the world. The cowboy ran. His boots pounded against the dry earth, kicking up dust under the blood-red moon. His breath came ragged, every exhale carrying the taste of iron. He didn't dare look back. Not at the road, not at the empty horizon stretching behind him. The sound of his own heartbeat roared in his ears, but beneath it, he heard something else. A growl, low, rumbling, close. His horse had screamed when it took him. One moment he was riding like the devil himself was behind him. Next thing he knew, the beast had let out a hellish shriek, and he was on the ground, rolling through the dirt. By the time he got to his feet, the horse was gone. Not a trace left. That was an hour ago, and he was still running. Then, like a miracle, he saw it. Lights in the distance, flickering through the dust. A town. Small, barely more than a few buildings, but salvation all the same. His legs burned as he pushed forward, willing himself to move faster. The saloon doors banged open as he staggered inside. The room went quiet. Patrons turned, mugs half raised, eyes squinting at the sorry bastard who had just stumbled in. He was drenched in sweat, his hat missing, his coat torn. His hands trembled as he made his way to the bar, barely keeping himself from collapsing. "Whiskey," he rasped, slamming a shaking hand down. "Now." The bartender, a grizzled old man with sharp eyes, poured without a word. The cowboy grabbed the glass, downing it in one burning gulp. He set it down, exhaling slow, trying to steady himself. Someone chuckled. "Long ride, friend?" The cowboy didn't answer. He reached into his coat, fingers brushing over the cold steel of the gun. The reason he was still alive. The reason he was being hunted. He pulled it out slow, just enough to glance at it. It was beautiful in the worst way. A revolver, old as sin, but pristine. Black steel, polished silver inlay. A grip carved from something that felt too warm to be bone. And etched along the barrel, barely visible in the dim light. A weapon meant for something other than men. He slid it back into his coat. His hands still trembled. The whispers in the back of his skull hadn't stopped since he'd stolen it. "You all right, stranger?" someone asked, tone wary now. Before he could answer, the cowboy staggered, his body swaying like a drunk. His mouth opened as if to speak, to warn them, to explain. His lips formed the first word. Then he collapsed. His head hit the bar with a sickening thud. His body went limp, the tension draining from his shoulders. The saloon fell deathly silent. The bartender stepped forward, cautiously nudging the man's shoulder. No response. The cowboy's face was slack, his eyes dull, staring into nothing. "He's dead," someone muttered. "Like hell he is," the bartender grumbled, leaning down to check. He felt the cold, clammy stillness of death settling in. The man was dead. The bartender was about to say something when the deputy's voice cut through the silence. "Riders coming." Everyone in the saloon turned toward the window. In the dim glow of the oil lamps outside, 6 cowboys rode toward the saloon, their silhouettes jagged against the night sky. The bartender frowned, his gut twisting. His eyes drifted back to the dead man on the floor. "This isn't good." He ran in here like he was running from someone. He knelt down, shoving a hand into the dead man's coat. His fingers brushed something cold, metal. He pulled it free. A gun. And not just any gun. The bartender exhaled sharply. "Hurry up!" he snapped, shoving the gun into his apron as he stood. "Get him in the back!" The drifter and the blacksmith grabbed the dead man's arms, dragging him toward the back room. The gambler moved fast, yanking a tablecloth off a nearby table. Evelyn, hands shaking, tried to act natural. The room was moving fast, but was it fast enough? Outside, the riders were almost there. The bartender took one last glance at the unnatural gun hidden in his apron. He had a bad feeling about all of this. The saloon doors creaked open, and the air inside turned thick with unease. The 6 riders stepped in, slow and deliberate, their boots scuffing against the wooden floor. Their dust-covered coats billowed slightly as they stopped just inside the entrance, scanning the room. They weren't lawmen. They weren't just passing through. These men were looking for something. The bartender didn't move, didn't blink. He was used to trouble walking through his doors, but this was different. He could feel it in his bones. He forced himself to grab a glass, wiping it with a cloth like nothing was out of the ordinary. The drifter leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on his knee, his expression unreadable. The gambler, as always, kept a calm, amused smile, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the rim of his whiskey glass. The blacksmith's jaw was tight. Evelyn's hands were clenched into fists in her lap. The deputy swallowed hard, his fingers twitching near his holster. Everyone was trying to act natural. The leader of the group stepped forward, tall, wiry, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but the weight of him was impossible to ignore. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. "Evenin'," he drawled, voice smooth, casual, too casual. "Sure is quiet in here." The bartender met his gaze, nodding once. "Ain't much going on tonight." The outlaw leader tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then, he took a slow step forward, letting his gaze drift over the room, studying every single face. His men spread out slightly, casually, but with purpose. "Thing is," the leader continued, "me and my boys, we were just out ridin'." His fingers drummed against his belt. "And wouldn't you know it, we saw a fella come running through the desert like the devil himself was on his back." The room stayed silent. The bartender's grip tightened around the glass. "Now, I ain't one to assume things," the outlaw went on, "but I got a feeling he might have ended up somewhere. Round here." His eyes landed on the bartender. "Maybe you seen him?" The bartender didn't flinch. He set the glass down, meeting the outlaw leader's stare with the calm indifference of a man who had seen plenty of trouble come through his doors. "Ain't seen no one like that," he said evenly, reaching for a bottle and pouring another drink, like this was just another night. Silas Kane's smirk twitched. The room felt hotter somehow. The weight of Kane's stare pressing down like a hammer waiting to drop. His fingers tapped against his gun belt, slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. His men shifted slightly, their movements lazy, but purposeful. They weren't buying it. Silas took a slow step forward, then another. "That's so?" he mused. "See, I ain't in the habit of being lied to, barkeep." The bartender shrugged. "Ain't in the habit of lying." A soft chuckle escaped Silas, but there was no real humor in it. He let his gaze drift away from the bartender, scanning the rest of the room. That's when he saw him. The blacksmith. Big. Broad. Already sitting stiff, his hands curled into fists on the table, his jaw locked tight. He wasn't just nervous, he was pissed. Silas smiled. There it is. Slowly, he turned his full attention to the blacksmith. "You all right there, big man?" Silas asked, tilting his head slightly. "Looking a little tense." The blacksmith didn't break eye contact, didn't shift, didn't blink. His fingers twitched, just slightly, as if itching for a weapon. The tension crackled in the air. The other outlaws picked up on it immediately. A few of them smirked, exchanging glances, like they'd seen this play out before. Silas took another slow step forward. "Something you want to say, big fella?" The blacksmith's jaw flexed. Then, finally, he spoke. "Why don't you quit running your mouth and get to the point?" The room went still. The bartender clenched his jaw. The drifter exhaled through his nose, eyes sharp. The gambler, still smiling, shifted slightly in his chair, hands loose, ready. Evelyn sucked in a breath. Silas just stood there, grinning. "Oh, I like you." His voice was smooth, almost warm. "Got some fight in you." Then, in a single, fluid motion, he reached up and pulled off his gloves. The smirks disappeared. The bartender's stomach dropped. Silas turned back to him, his grin still fixed in place. "See, barkeep?" He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "You don't seem to know who the hell I am." His men chuckled darkly. One of them muttered, "Oh, here we go." Silas reached for the small knife hanging from a leather cord around his neck. The blade caught the dim light. The blacksmith tensed. The bartender swallowed hard. Silas turned to the room, his voice a slow, controlled growl. "And that's a real shame." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men grabbed the bartender, yanking him forward, slamming him against the bar. Silas stepped up close. The bartender's breath came heavy, His eye locked onto the knife now inches from his face. "Because I only ask nice once." And then, the blade pressed against his eye. The bartender gritted his teeth, his breathing ragged, but he didn't scream. Blood trickled down his cheek. Silas leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Where's the goddamn gun?" The knife dug deeper, the cold steel pressing against the ruined flesh around the bartender's eye. Blood ran in thin rivulets down his cheek, pooling at the corner of his mouth. But he didn't scream. He gritted his teeth, nostrils flaring as he forced himself to breathe slow, steady. The pain was unbearable, a white-hot fire burning through his skull, but he wouldn't give Silas the satisfaction. Silas watched him closely, waiting, expecting the moment when the old man cracked. But it never came. The bartender stayed silent. A few agonizing moments stretched between them before Silas let out a long sigh. He pulled the knife back, flicking the blood off the blade with a quick motion. He gave the bartender a slow once-over, then tilted his head slightly, as if reconsidering. "You know," he muttered, almost to himself, "I think maybe you really don't know." His voice was unreadable. Whether he actually believed it or not was unclear. Then, without looking away, he snapped his fingers. His men shoved the bartender back against the bar hard. His breath left him in a ragged grunt, but he stayed on his feet, barely. Silas turned away, wiping the blade against his coat. "That's all right," he said, voice light, almost amused. "Not everyone's useful." Then, his eyes landed on the drifter. A slow grin stretched across his face. "But you—" The drifter, leaning back in his chair, didn't flinch. He didn't tighten his jaw. He didn't break a sweat. He just stared back, unbothered. Calm. Casual. He took a breath, exhaled slow. "Silas Kane." His voice was smooth, knowing. Silas raised an eyebrow. The drifter smirked. "Damn shame what happened to your brother." Silas stopped moving. The air in the saloon shifted. His men stiffened. The bartender, still catching his breath, barely tilted his head, sensing the tension change. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a chuckle. Low at first. Then growing. Silas shook his head slowly, a genuine smirk pulling at his lips. "Now that's interesting." He took a step forward, boots clicking against the wood, eyeing the drifter like a snake sizing up prey. "You know me." The drifter shrugged. "Know of you." "Do tell." The drifter ran a finger idly along the rim of his whiskey glass. "They say you're the last man standing after a fight, that you let folks think they got the upper hand, right up until they don't." He paused, locking eyes with him. "And when you kill a man, you like to make it personal." Silas grinned. "Damn right." The room exhaled slightly, the shift in tone dangerous, but less immediate. Silas liked hearing about himself. "And you?" Silas asked, pulling a chair around and straddling it lazily, arms crossed over the backrest. "You got a name, or do I just call you Drifter?" The drifter smirked. "Call me whatever you like." Silas laughed. "Oh, I do like you." He leaned in, dropping his voice slightly. "You ever thought about joining up with a crew that knows how to make money?" The drifter raised an eyebrow. "That what you're offering?" Silas nodded, a glint of amusement in his eye. "I got room for men like you. Men who know when to speak and when to shut up." The drifter considered him for a long moment. He could feel every eye in the room watching, waiting. He smiled. "And what's the cut?" Silas grinned wide. "Oh, I think you'd find it worth your while." The drifter leaned back slightly, tilting his head, pretending to think it over. Truth was, he already knew the answer, but whether or not Silas did, well, that was going to be the fun part. The drifter remained relaxed in his chair, watching Silas with that same unreadable smirk. But before the outlaw leader could press for an answer, his sharp eyes caught something across the room. A signal, subtle, but there. The deputy and the blacksmith, stealing glances at each other. A flick of the fingers, a barely perceptible nod. Silas's smirk faded. His fingers stopped tapping against the chair's backrest as his gaze hardened. "Tell you what," he muttered, standing up slow, adjusting his coat. "You think it over." He patted the drifter's shoulder once, almost friendly. "Got more pressin' matters need my attention." Then he turned, all focus on the deputy now. The deputy, already nervous, tensed up. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. He tried to hold his ground, but as Silas approached, the weight of the moment pressed in on him. Silas didn't even have to speak. He just stared. And in that stare, the deputy was already breaking. His breathing shallowed. His pulse quickened. His throat bobbed with a nervous swallow. Silas took his time, his movements slow, controlled. Each step deliberate. He wasn't just walking toward the deputy. He was cornering him. But just as he was closing in, the blacksmith scoffed. Silas's eye twitched. The blacksmith was grinning. That same infuriating, daring expression, like he was begging Silas to come for him instead. Silas exhaled sharply through his nose, flexing his fingers at his sides. He saw exactly what the blacksmith was trying to do. Take control of the moment, steer the conversation. And for a second, it almost worked. Almost. But Silas wasn't about to play that game. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the deputy, letting the blacksmith's antics stew in the background. Let him wait. Let him burn. Silas's attention was still locked on the deputy. "You're shaken," he murmured, almost gently. The deputy tried to stand firm. "Ain't shaken," he muttered. Silas chuckled, taking another slow, creeping step closer. "Oh, you are. Just a little. But it's there." The deputy's fingers twitched again. His breath hitched slightly. Silas smiled. "So, tell me, lawman." He tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "What exactly are you so damn nervous about?" The deputy's pulse thundered in his ears. The blacksmith's grin faded slightly. The game was back in Silas's hands, and he was just getting started. No matter how much he tried to hold still, to keep his hands steady, to breathe normal, it wasn't working. And Silas saw it all. The outlaw leader loomed over him, tilting his head slightly, watching the nervous ticks with a slow, creeping smirk. "You ever kill a man, deputy?" Silas's voice was barely above a whisper now, just between the two of them. The deputy didn't answer. Silas leaned in closer, his breath warm against the side of the deputy's face. "I think I know the answer." He reached up, trailing a single finger down the deputy's arm. The deputy flinched. Silas chuckled. "See, real killers," he murmured. "They don't shake, they don't stutter, they don't smell like fear the way you do right now." The deputy's breath hitched. "You ain't a lawman." Silas shook his head. "You're just a scared little boy playing dress-up." Silas takes his gun and tosses to a nearby outlaw. His hand shifted, pressing lightly against the deputy's chest, feeling the wild thump of his heartbeat. "Lord Almighty," Silas whispered, amused. "I can feel it, just hammering away in there." The deputy squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, struggling to hold himself together. Silas just smiled, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "So what's got you so scared, deputy?" he whispered. "The fact that I might kill you?" He paused. "Or the fact that you know you ain't got the guts to stop me?" That was it. That was the breaking point. The deputy's lips trembled, his whole body tensed. His knees were locking up, but his hands were practically twitching at his sides. The dam inside him finally cracked. I don't know where the gun is." Silas stilled. The room went quiet. Silas stared at the deputy for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes flicked to the bartender, who was just sitting there, expressionless, still clutching the ruined hole where his eye used to be. No fear, no reaction, just silence. Silas narrowed his eyes. The deputy swallowed hard, breath ragged. "But," he hesitated, glancing at the bartender. Then, barely above a whisper, "He does." All eyes turned to the bartender. He didn't move, didn't deny it, didn't even acknowledge it. Just sat there, unfazed. For the first time, Silas's smirk wavered. For a second, just a second, he almost believed it. The bartender had already been through hell. After everything, would a man really still be able to lie to his face? But no. No way. No one could take that kind of pain and still keep a secret. Silas's jaw ticked. He had been lied to. And he hated being lied to. Without warning, he grabbed the deputy's collar and ripped him forward, sending him crashing to the floor. "No!" The roar shook the room. For the first time, Silas's composure snapped. His men stiffened, startled. They've seen Silas Kane lose his cool before. The blacksmith was already moving. He lunged forward, reaching for the deputy, trying to stop whatever was about to happen. But before he could, 3 of Silas's men grabbed him, holding him back. Silas turned to him, eyes burning, teeth gritted. For a split second, he looked ready to kill. Then, he inhaled. Exhaled. And just like that, his face calmed. His hand loosened. His breathing slowed. He smoothed a hand down his coat, resetting himself like the moment had never happened. Then, he smirked, collected, cool, back in control. Chee. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. Almost lost my temper there. He turned back toward the deputy, gripping his knife once more. Now. He exhaled slowly, cracking his neck. Where were we? The deputy whimpered. The deputy was shaking uncontrollably now, his breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat rolling down his face. Silas crouched in front of him, almost gentle. "I don't like being lied to." His voice was low, almost soothing. He ran a thumb along the blade of his knife, testing the edge. "And you see? I got a special little tool for liars." He didn't look away as he snapped his fingers toward one of his men. "Ryder, go get the jaw ripper." The room froze. The outlaw named Ryder hesitated. Even among killers, that name carried weight. Silas lifted his head slightly. "Did I stutter?" Ryder swallowed hard, then nodded. He turned and made his way toward the door, stepping outside. The deputy whimpered, his whole body locking up. But then, the blacksmith spoke. "Why don't you try me, tough guy?" Silas stilled. Slowly he turned. The blacksmith was already watching him, a slow, steady rage burning behind his eyes. He sat still, too still, like a man waiting, like a man ready. Silas's expression shifted. He knew what this was. The blacksmith was baiting him, trying to get him riled up, trying to pull him into a fight, trying to kill him. And for the first time, Silas actually smiled. "Oh," he chuckled, stepping forward slightly, tilting his head. "I get it now." He let it play out. Let the blacksmith think he was winning. He could see the tension in the blacksmith's shoulders, the subtle shift in his fingers, the way his muscles coiled, waiting. The blacksmith had a knife, and he was going to use it. The trick was figuring out how. Would he lunge? Would he try to rush him? No, the blacksmith was too calm. Silas almost didn't see it coming. The blacksmith's arm flicked. The knife wasn't for a lunge. It was for a throw. And the bastard knew how to throw. Silas barely had time to react, but he was fast. His hand shot up. The knife buried itself clean into his palm. Silence. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Silas looked down at his hand, at the blade now sticking straight through it. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes back up. The blacksmith's breath hitched. Silas smirked. Then he pulled his gun. Bang! 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 A volley of shots tore into the blacksmith's chest, sending him jerking backward, blood spraying across the floorboards. He fell against the bar, gasping, sliding down as his legs gave out. Silas exhaled slowly, stepping up to him, boots clicking against the wood. He grinned. That was a really nice try. His voice was almost impressed. It really was. He crouched down, pressing the barrel of his gun right against the blacksmith's forehead. But not good enough. Bang. A pause. Bang. A longer pause. The blacksmith's body twitched. Then, 3 bangs back to back. Silas tilted his head slightly, looking down at him, as if considering. Then, one last time. Bang. The blacksmith slumped forward, lifeless. Silas inhaled deeply, exhaling through his nose. He flexed his injured hand, the knife still buried deep. Then, without a word, he yanked it out. Blood dripped to the floor. Silas chuckled, rolling his shoulders. Whew. He shook his head. I needed that. Then, he turned his gaze back to the rest of the room. The message was clear. Nobody tried that again. Outside the saloon, Ryder stomped through the dirt, jaw clenched tight, his breath coming in angry huffs. His fingers twitched as he rummaged through the wagon, grabbing the jaw ripper. His hands shook with rage. Silas, mocking him. Again. He could still hear it. Ryder, go get the jaw ripper. The way Silas dragged out his name, stretching every syllable like he was toying with a wounded dog. Ryder ground his teeth together. Thinks he's funny, he muttered through clenched teeth. Mocking me like I ain't worth shit. His fingers dug into the wooden handle of the jaw ripper, his knuckles turning white. He should have been long gone by now, Ripper thought to himself. Ryder and the thief that brought the gun to the saloon had a plan. Steal the gun. Sell it. Split the cash. Only Ryder didn't know that Trick the thief was dead. He thought that bastard ran off with the gun without him. Left him here with Silas. Where the hell are you, Trick? He growled, kicking at the dirt, still seething. He stuttered. We were supposed to take off together, you some bitch. Silence. The wind shifted slightly, a breeze rolling through the dark alley beside the wagon. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Ryder. Ryder froze. His breath hitched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. That voice. He knew that voice. His head snapped toward the alley. Nothing. Just the dark. Still. Empty. But he knew what he heard. His fingers tightened around the jaw ripper. Then it came again. Ryder, where the hell you been? Ryder's stomach twisted. He whirled around, scanning the darkness. No one. But his pulse was pounding. Trick? He stammered, squinting into the shadows. Silence. Then, a shuffle of movement, soft, subtle, closer. Ryder's breath quickened. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then the voice again. I'm sorry I left you, Ryder. Ryder spun around, gun drawn. Nothing. Just the dark. He took a shaky breath and stuttered. No. Don't play with me, Trick. Silence. Then, right at his ear. I've got the money, Ryder. Ryder's blood ran ice cold. He stumbled back, eyes wild, darting around. You son of a bitch, he stammered, chest rising and falling fast. You left me, Trick. Well, we were supposed to split it, but you ran. Silence. Then, a whisper from the dark. I didn't run, Ryder. I was taken. Ryder froze. Then the darkness moved. Faster than anything he'd ever seen. A blur of jagged limbs. A shadow stretching unnaturally, curling around him. A wet, tearing sound. Ryder barely had time to scream. His whole body jerked unnaturally as something latched onto him, twisting, pulling, yanking. Then, a sharp, gut-wrenching snap. Ryder's legs gave out. His hands spasmed. His breath caught in his throat, then stopped. His body hit the ground, twitching. For a brief moment he tried to crawl, but it dragged him back into the dark. And just like that, Ryder was gone. The jaw ripper lay abandoned in the dirt, gleaming under the pale moonlight. The wind howled through the empty street, and the night remained silent. Back inside, the saloon felt colder now. The blacksmith's lifeless body was still slumped against the bar, his blood slowly pooling across the floor. The smell of gunpowder and death thickened the air. Silas stood over him, breathing deep, calming himself. Then he turned, and his eyes locked onto Evelyn. She had been holding it together as best as she could, keeping her fear buried, trying to mask her trembling hands with controlled breaths. But Silas saw through all of it. His grin was slow, creeping. He took a step forward, boots clicking against the wooden floor. "You see that, sweetheart?" He motioned toward the blacksmith's ruined corpse with his bloodied hand. "That's what happens to folks who piss me off." Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat tight. Silas tilted his head slightly, studying her, like a predator sizing up its next meal. "Now, here's the real question." His voice dropped lower, taking his time. "What do you think happens to little things like you when I really lose my patience?" The room was silent. No one dared move. Evelyn's hands clenched into shaking fists. Silas grinned, leaning in close, his voice a whisper meant just for her. "Bet I could take you apart real slow." His tone was almost playful. "Bet you'd scream real nice." Her breath hitched. Silas pulled back slightly, his grin widening. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the arm and threw her aside. She hit the floor hard, coughing, barely catching herself before she could hit her head. Silas barely spared her another glance, already shouting, "Where the hell is that jaw ripper?" He ran a hand through his hair, huffing. "Guess I'll have to improvise." He turned to one of his men. "Go find that stuttering son of a bitch. Leave the jaw ripper, we don't need it anymore." The outlaw hesitated, glancing toward the exit. Silas gritted his teeth. "Go!" The man hurried off, disappearing into the night. Silas exhaled through his nose. Then, he moved. Fast. He grabbed a shotgun off the nearest outlaw. The deputy barely had time to react before Silas was on him, pressing the barrel under his chin. The deputy's eyes widened in pure horror. No! Wait!" Boom! The shotgun roared. The deputy's head snapped back violently, his jaw completely obliterated, blood and bones splattering across the wall. His body twitched, gurgling sounds choking out of what was left of his throat. He tried to scream, but there was no jaw to move. Silas let out a low whistle. "Well, ain't that something? Looks like he finally learned when to shut up." His men laughed. The rest of the room? Frozen in horror. The deputy's body slumped forward, his twitching slowing until he finally went still. Silas rested the shotgun over his shoulder, cracking his neck. Then, he turned back toward Evelyn. "Now, where were we?" The saloon smelled like blood and gunpowder. The blacksmith was dead. The deputy was dead. Evelyn was next. And that's when the gambler spoke. All right. Enough of this." His voice cut through the thick, suffocating tension. And for the first time all night, he had Silas's full attention. Silas turned, shotgun still resting on his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. The hell was this? The gambler exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly, one hand drumming against the table. His movements were slow, relaxed, calculated. "Look, I ain't got a stake in this." His voice was smooth, steady. "I don't give a damn about some gun. I don't give a damn about heroes. What I do give a damn about." He flicked a glance at the dead deputy. "Odds." Silas's lip curled into an amused smirk. "Odds?" The gambler nodded, still drumming his fingers. "I'm a betting man. I bet on games, on fights, on who's walking out of here alive." He exhaled, leaning back now, legs crossed, the picture of confidence. "And right now, Silas, the way I see it, the odds ain't in our favor." The saloon was deathly silent. Silas tilted his head slightly. The gambler gestured around the room lazily. "You got control, I'll give you that. No one's stopping you. But me?" He smirked. "I see patterns, and the pattern is real simple. Whoever pisses you off gets killed. We keep this up, and eventually there ain't gonna be nobody left to kill." Silas chuckled. The gambler leaned forward again, voice dropping slightly. "So, let's make a deal." Silas's eyes gleamed with amusement. "I do like deals." The gambler spread his hands. "I bet that if I gave you the gun, you'd be on your way, and the rest of us would walk out of here, alive and well." Silas stared at him. Then, he laughed. A real laugh. Genuine amusement. Well. He leaned against the bar, shotgun still casually resting on his shoulder. A man after my own heart. He grinned at the gambler, eyes glinting. Yeah, I'll take that bet. The gambler smiled, a knowing smile. The others in the room weren't smiling. The gambler took his time, adjusting his cuffs, rolling his shoulders. He looked around at the remaining patrons, his voice still smooth, still carefully controlled. Now, let's talk real odds. He lifted a hand and ticked off each point. We started with a room full of patrons. 2 are dead. That's, what, a good 20? Maybe 30% gone? If we keep fighting, how much more are we going to lose? 50? 60? Silas watched, entertained. The gambler spread his hands. Or, we cut our losses. 1 more body, just 1 more, and we all walk away. In the grand scheme of things, that's a damn good deal. Silas nodded approvingly. Now you're speaking my language. The gambler smiled, slow and easy. Then, he gestured toward the back room. I'll tell you where the gun is. Silas's eyes darkened. The gambler exhaled, gesturing lazily. Now, when we were moving the poor bastard's body. He pointed at the back. That's where you'll find your thief. Silas blinked, then let out a soft, huh. The gambler wasn't done. He smiled wider, shaking his head slightly. And, while everyone was making a big fuss over the body, I saw something real interesting. He turned, slowly, locking eyes with the bartender. Silas followed his gaze. The bartender stiffened. The gambler grinned. Ol' Sam here. Real sneaky bastard. Silas's expression shifted. The gambler exhaled through his nose, smiling almost apologetically. See, while we were all busy cleaning up the mess, he slipped something into the safe. The room froze. Silas's smile vanished. The bartender closed his eyes briefly. The gambler sighed, almost dramatically, turning back toward Silas. That's where your gun is. Silas didn't move, didn't speak. Then, he smirked. He clapped his hands together once, slow. Now that is a damn good play. The gambler smiled, not a pleased smile, a resigned one, like a man who already knew what was coming. He let out a slow exhale and turned back toward the bartender. Sorry, Sam. The bartender, still clutching his ruined eye, spat blood onto the floor. You son of a bitch! The gambler nodded, still smiling. Yeah. Silas grinned wide. Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves a winner. The saloon was dead silent. The gambler had just sold out Sam. Silas should have been grinning, but he wasn't. He stood there, clenching his jaw, flexing his injured hand, still slick with blood. His eyes burned into Sam. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but laced with pure venom. You know, Sam, I ought to carve you open right here, gut you slow, let you bleed out while the others watch. Sam said nothing, just sat there, holding his ruined eye, breathing heavy. Silas exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I should be shooting you dead right now. You know that, don't you? He took a step forward, tilting his head. After all, I don't like liars. He tapped his temple. And you? You had me convinced. His fingers flexed like he wanted to rip Sam apart with his bare hands. Then, his smirk returned. Lucky for you, you got a way out. He crouched slightly, his voice dropping to that slow, menacing whisper. You're gonna open that safe for me, Sam. Sam exhaled hard through his nose. And if I don't? Silas's grin stretched wider. Then I kill you, and open it anyway. The room was thick with tension. Sam inhaled slowly. He had no way out of this. But before anything else could happen, the saloon doors burst open. The outlaw sent to get Ryder stumbled inside, panting, his face twisted in sheer terror. It's here! It's here! He screamed. It's just like the legend! Everyone whipped around. The outlaw was rambling, his eyes wild. I saw it. It was talking like Ryder and Trick. Silas's blood ran cold. He stiffened immediately, because he knew exactly what that meant. The creature was following the gun. However the hell it did it, it was drawn to it. And it had been sitting in that safe long enough for the damn thing to still think it was there. Silas's rage melted into sharp, precise thought. They had time. Not much, but enough. His hand snapped out, gripping Sam's collar. "We're opening that safe, now." He dragged Sam forward, his boots scraping against the floor. The others were still frozen, eyes flicking between the outlaw at the door and Silas hauling Sam toward the back. Then, Silas paused. He turned his head slightly, looking toward the gambler. A slow smirk returned to his lips. "You know, I like you." The gambler blinked, caught off guard. Silas reached into his coat, pulling something out. He tossed it toward the gambler. The gambler caught it, blinking down at it. A single bullet. Gold casing. Silver tip. It hummed with an unnatural weight. The gambler's brow furrowed. "What's this?" Silas grinned. "Something to even the odds." Then, without another word, he dragged Sam toward the safe. Outside. Something moved. Something big. The wind shifted, and the creature was coming. In the back room. Sam's breath was ragged, chest rising and falling as he leaned against the safe. "No." Sam screamed again, "No." Silas's eye twitched. His fingers flexed at his sides, barely containing himself. "Sam," he muttered, voice low and slow, like a snake winding around its prey. "Open the goddamn safe." Sam just shook his head. "You don't understand what we're dealing with, Sam." Silas took a deep breath, then grabbed Sam by the collar, shoving him against the cold metal. "You don't know what's out there." Silas's voice dropped into a dangerous whisper. "You don't see what's happening?" The room creaked, the old wood groaning like it was suffocating under the weight of something unnatural. Silas's eyes burned into Sam's. "You think you're keeping that thing locked up?" His grip tightened. "All you're doing is keeping us all trapped inside with it." Sam exhaled shakily. For the first time that night, real fear filled his one remaining eye. Silas pushed harder. "You open that safe, Sam. You open it before it's too late." Sam looked away. Then, slowly, his hand moved toward the lock. The dial spun. A heavy click. The safe door swung open. Inside. Something glinted under the lamplight. Silas's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over it. His voice was barely a whisper. The final piece. Front of the saloon, the creature attacks. A thunderous crash. The front doors ripped off their hinges, slamming into the walls with an ear-splitting bang. The creature rushed inside, pure muscle, claws like scythes, eyes burning with something ancient and inhuman. The outlaws opened fire. Bullets tore into it. It didn't stop. The first outlaw barely had time to scream before a massive clawed hand tore him in half. Blood splattered against the walls. Another outlaw tried to run, but the beast was faster, slamming him against a support beam so hard his bones shattered. The gambler grabbed Evelyn and the drifter, dragging them toward the back. "Move! Move!" They ducked behind overturned tables, dodging bodies and gunfire. The creature was unstoppable. It slaughtered everything in its path. The three of them burst through the back room. Silas barely glanced at them, still staring into the safe. The gambler grabbed the drifter's coat. "Wait." The drifter turned, breath ragged, eyes wild with adrenaline. The gambler reached into his coat and pulled out a silver pistol. He spun it once, then held it out. "Won this in Ireland." The gambler smirked. "Some fool told me it was enchanted. Might be true for all I know." The drifter took the pistol. The gambler then pressed the bullet Silas had given him into the drifter's palm. "You only got one shot. Make it count." The drifter's fingers curled around the bullet. His lips parted slightly. His eyes flickered with something deep, something painful. "I swore I'd never kill again," he murmured. "But that thing's a monster." He loaded the bullet, raised the gun, took a steady breath, and fired. The bullet ripped through the creature's heart. It howled, a guttural, inhuman wail. The shot actually hurt it. The monster staggered, its limbs twitching violently, smoke rising from the wound. The heart shot was the right call, but it wasn't enough. It was still coming. The gambler, Evelyn, and the drifter turned toward the back room. Sam was dead. His eyes were gone. His chest was ripped open, his insides hollowed out. Evelyn screamed. The drifter grabbed her wrist. Go! They barreled through the back door, slamming it shut behind them. They grabbed whatever they could, barrels, tables, crates, shoving them against the door. Then they ran. The three stumbled into the dark, lungs burning, blood pounding in their ears. Evelyn gasped for breath, eyes still wide with horror. The drifter glanced back. The saloon glowed with fire, and beyond it, Silas Kane, sitting on a black horse, watching them, watching everything. The wind whipped around him, carrying the embers of the burning town. Silas's expression was unreadable. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a strange-looking detonator. Futuristic. He turned it over in his hand, then exhaled a slow, satisfied breath. Here's a piece of the future, you alien son of a bitch. He hit the button. Inside the saloon, the creature staggered forward, snarling, still weakened from the bullet. It paused. It smelled the safe. It moved toward it. Its claws reached forward. Boom! The explosion ripped through the saloon, flames bursting out of every window. The shockwave sent the remaining bodies flying. The structure groaned, then collapsed in on itself. A fireball roared into the night sky. The gambler, Evelyn, and the drifter watched from the ridge. Smoke and fire choked out the night. The creature was gone. Silas? Gone. They watched as he rode off into the desert, disappearing into the night. The gambler exhaled. He wiped his hands on his coat, then let out a breathless chuckle. Well, that was a hell of a hand. The drifter said nothing, just watched the flames. Evelyn wiped her eyes. What now? The gambler rolled his shoulders. We walk. Hope the sun's kind in the morning. The three of them turned away from the burning wreckage and walked into the darkness. The devil's iron was gone, but the legend had just begun.